Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 348. This week the questions are taken from guide 419 on the French ironclad very early pre-dreadnought Hoche and the Wednesday video on destroyer development in World War II. So let's get on. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, while we know of France's many failures of design in the pre-dreadnought era, given how chaotic their design teams were, surely they must at some point have passed over some good idea or incorporated a good idea into their ships. Were there any known examples of French design that in hindsight would have been a preferable option for France, or was a good idea just concealed by an ugly exterior? The thing you've got to remember when looking at French pre-dreadnoughts and late ironclads is that there are actually a lot of very advanced technologies hidden away within a hull that looks very odd to almost everyone, including, to be fair, a lot of people at the time. For example, France, although this goes a little bit further back than the period of Hoche, France was ahead in things like incorporating working breech loaders into their main armament. And then around the time of Hoche and afterwards, France is also a leader in turret-mounted secondary batteries. They have those, as you can see here, on Liberté and on a number of other ships in the 1890s, where everyone else is still doing unshielded mounts or open casemates. Just before Hoche's period, France was also a leader in incorporating steel, both as armour and as a structural material. During the pre-dreadnought period, the French are also leaders in the electrification of ships, as in being able to have electric motors rotating the turrets as opposed to hydraulic systems, which other people end up having to use in part because they don't have that capability. So there's lots of individual elements that would, if put together, would make a really, really nice ship. The thing that lets them down a lot of the time, at least in the early pre-dreadnought period, is armament layout and hull form. But as I've covered in a previous video, those restrictions are mostly down to factors that the French ship designers themselves cannot control. Namely, firstly, officers, admirals within the Marine Nationale who are convinced that you need all-round fire because they think that battles are going to be extremely close-range melees, in which case having the lozenge arrangement where you can bring 3 guns to bear on any bearing is going to be better than a 2 twin turret arrangement where, yeah, you can bring 4 guns on the broadside but only 2 fore and aft. And of course, if the people who are ordering your ships say, well, this is the tactic we think we're going to use, therefore this is the gun layout we want, you have to make that work. And part of making that work is the tumble home. And the other factor, which also influences the choice of tumble home, is the French infrastructure. If your dockyards physically cannot build a ship large enough to incorporate all the things you want to incorporate, then either you have to drop capabilities, which wasn't really an option in most cases, or you have to start making really weird design compromises, like an extreme tumble home on the hull. The interesting thing is that in the aftermath of the fleet of samples or the fleet of experiments, the ships that immediately post-date Hoche, you actually see the move with the Charlemagnes to twin turret mounts, like as you can see here with Liberté, a slightly later vessel. But even then, the ship designers are saying, look, we can do this, it will work, but they're facing resistance from some, not all, but some elements of the upper echelons of the Marine Nationale saying, no, we still want our lozenge arrangements. But fortunately, a slight majority of French naval officers at that point really want their twin main battery turrets, and so they get them. And of course, the other thing to bear in mind is that while it's always fun to point and laugh at things like the unpronounceable name with a J and Carnot and so forth, this isn't just us, using hindsight to say they're pretty terrible designs, and it's not even us as non-French people saying they're pretty terrible designs. The French at the time didn't think they were very good designs either. You've probably all heard or seen the video when hotels go to war, and some people I've seen on the internet get very offended. Oh, Drax being derogatory to the French. Blah, blah, blah. It's like, no, the French invented that name. They dubbed Hoche Le Grand Hôtel. They came up with that title, not me. And they applied it ruthlessly to poor old Hoche. And similarly for her successors, Carnot and Bouvet and Ship J, etc. The French call them the Fleet of Experiments or the Fleet of Samples. They were not happy with that result either. It was very much a case of a small group of people who thought they knew what they were doing, and everybody else, even in France at the time, going, no, you really, really don't. And in fact, in the book French Battleships of World War One, written by Jordan and Caresse, Clue, the second one, is a French historian, that whole episode is actually described as an exercise in vanity more akin to an essay writing competition where the prize is the commissioning of a warship from the top 4 winners. So in other words, give French ship designers a dockyard that's actually capable of building a ship of meaningful size, a budget that's more than 6 francs and 2 centimes, and as long as you don't constrain them with one fixed tactical doctrine you're convinced will be the panacea for all naval combat, and they can turn out some pretty good stuff. If you inflict all of the previous stuff on them, well, you get what you get. Me Lambert asks, we call pre-dreadnought such because they came before Dreadnought, but obviously the British didn't know that Dreadnought was coming, so what did they call battleships in the 1890s? Did they keep referring to them as ironclads? I know H.G. Wells refers to Thunderchild and the rest of the Channel Fleet as ironclads. Now, was that common, or was that a mistake on his part? For the most part, officially they were just termed battleships, a slightly weird divergence in the mid-part of the 19th century to call the ships liners had, fortunately, disappeared. But both the terms liner and battleship actually come from the same root, because officially a capital ship, a ship that you would put in your battle fleet to fight the main battle at that point, was known as a line of battle ship. Now, in the Napoleonic era, a foreshortening of that was ship of the line. So that's kind of almost an intermediate step with a slight rearrangement of words. But if you go back to line of battle ship, if you take the line of bit away, you get battleship. And if you take the battleship part away, you get line of, or liner, as in a ship of the line, a liner. And that's where you get those two terms. Fortunately, I think, from my perspective, liner died out and battleship prevailed. But in the 1890s, there was also a certain prevalence of calling battleships ironclads. Now, this is kind of from two perspectives. Firstly, even in the 1890s, it was majority correct, because outside of a handful of cruisers, the vast majority of ships that had belt armor were capital ships, and the vast majority of those in service were, in some way, shape, or form, legitimately describable as ironclads. Even the Royal Sovereign class in the UK, which, bear in mind, the last of those just about is entering service in the mid-1890s, they are still protected by compound armour. Now, fair enough, yes, compound armour does have a steel component to it, but it also has a substantial iron component to it, because it's a steel and iron sandwich. So you are technically correct, as well as colloquially correct, in calling even them sort of ironclads. Now, fair enough, the Majestics are entering service right after the Royal Sovereigns, also in the mid-1890s, but, the 1895-1896 portion as opposed to 1893-1894, and they have steel armour, but you're talking about a shift in the middle of the decade, and something where the use of ironclad as in big, heavily armoured capital ship as a colloquial term is still going to hang on for a little while. And actually, in that respect, the colloquial use of ironclad probably actually dies out a lot faster in the 19th and early 20th centuries as compared to some colloquial terms you see the press using these days, because by the middle of the 1900s, i.e., 1903, 4, 5, 6, 7, you don't really see the term ironclad used at all anymore. Even colloquially, people are now just referring to battleships and cruisers and so forth. Whereas, well, look at press articles these days and they're still calling Navy ships in the 2020s battleships. And no, I don't mean the Iowas, I mean things like the Arleigh Burkes or the Type 45s, or hilariously, if anyone remembers right back to the Second Gulf War, some Iraqi river patrol boats are referred to as Iraqi battleships. So in the mid-1890s, battleship or ironclad would be freely used, and as I said, in the most part, 85-90% of cases, even towards the end of the 1890s, ironclad would even be technically correct, as well as just a general term. Alugen asks, expended as a live fire target. Quite some number of ships you review end up as targets. Have you ever come across reports on how well these old ships held up under fire? Yes, there were actually a surprising number of live fire target trials which were recorded in extreme detail and survive. The fact that it's recorded in extreme detail in and of itself isn't actually that surprising. It's perhaps more surprising that they're all retained, because when navies, especially at this time period, went through live fire trials with old ships, the intention wasn't just for everyone to have a nice field day blowing something up for a change, as opposed to just, pounding the ocean. There was a very clear and distinct objective going on. Sometimes it was just a case of, well, this ship is obsolete but has something vaguely resembling a modern protection system, so let's see how our guns perform in actuality against real life armor and so forth. Other times it was a case of, well, we've specially modified this ship to represent a even more advanced protection system. It's why there's a picture of Empress of India here, because she was used as a live fire target for a specific reason. It not just to see how well a ship would hold up under fire and see what effects modern shells would have, but also in her particular case to ascertain what the difficulties were of firing on one ship with multiple ships. And in other trials against other similar ships at the time, they would do things like rig up a section of the ship so that it had an equal protection system to either a ship just introduced or a ship they were planning on introducing, and then fire at that to see how that would stand up in a real world environment braced against an actual hull with the potential of leaks and stuff caused by potential secondary effects. And of course, because they want to know all of this, it means they're also recording all of this. And it turns out that, generally speaking, once you've taken the fuel and the ammunition out of a large, heavily subdivided, somewhat armoured vessel, they actually prove very difficult to sink, because even if you poke holes in them, if nothing catches fire spectacularly or blows up spectacularly, and it's not moving particularly, so it's not having water forced into those holes, just coming in naturally under pressure, it can take a very long time and a lot of firepower to actually put a ship down. Now, to be fair, the first few times they tried live fire exercises, people were generally somewhat surprised by this, but very quickly they went, aha, well, if this is the case, then we can do things like fire a certain kind of shell at a certain portion of the ship, then we stop firing, we put people on board, and we go, right, that is the effect, record, right, now we get off, and we fire with a different kind of shell, or a different technique, or a different kind of ammunition, record, etc. To the point that eventually you got to a stage where a number of live fire exercises were conducted in very shallow water, because they knew eventually you were going to sink the ship, and perhaps with torpedo testing, perhaps rather quickly. But if the ship only sank, 5-10 feet, it was still potentially above the water in some respects, you could relatively easily patch up, salvage it, and then analyze what had happened and potentially repeat the exercise, and so on and so forth. The ones where you tend to find ships holding up perhaps a lot more than was at least officially anticipated tend to be exercises where they're trying to show off. Where they're like, oh yeah, well, this ship is so old, its armor scheme is so out of date, it really isn't going to tell us anything new. So we're just going to demonstrate the firepower of all our new weapons, 2-3 decades more modern than this ship, and we're just going to easily put it down and show off to the press and the politicians. And why is it still afloat? Quickly break out the torpedoes. Look, for example, at the sinking of Texas's sister ship USS New York for an example of that kind of thing. Silverjohn asks a series of related questions about battleships being withdrawn to home ports in the middle of a war in order to have the barrels of their main guns replaced. So first he asks, how long did this process typically take? Well, it does depend to a certain extent how many guns a ship has. If it has 13 or 14 guns, then it's going to obviously take a little bit longer than if it has 6 or 8. But it could be done in a remarkably quick time, a couple of weeks or less. So take, for example, HMS Invincible. After the Battle of the Falkland Islands in World War One, the battlecruiser was found to have 4 of her 12-inch guns worn out enough to need replacing. So she was sent in for a quick refit to replace those guns, amongst other things. So, of course, you had to take the turret roofs off, pull the guns out, put new ones in, put the turret roofs back on, check everything was still properly aligned. And she did all of that in just a fraction over 2 weeks, but at the same time, she was having a variety of other modifications made, including to her secondary battery. And this is one of the things in that when you bring a ship in for something like replacing its main guns, people tend to do other work as well, which can somewhat obscure exactly how long it takes to replace the guns. But that's just one example with Invincible, and that does seem to be in keeping with jobs where the main objective is to replace the guns, and they may be doing a bunch of other stuff that's relatively short to do at the same time. It seems to take maybe between a week and 3 weeks, depending on exactly how many guns are being changed on the ship, and obviously also if they have the guns in stock at the dockyard or if they have to wait for them to arrive. Next he asks, were the secondary guns, including dual-purpose models on World War II aircraft carriers or small caliber main guns on destroyers and cruisers, subject to similar restrictions on rounds fired? Yes, in principle, they do all have barrel lives. The barrel life tends to be a little bit different to a battleship's main gun just because of the sheer power of the charges in a capital ship's gun, but also because of their small size and in part how they were mounted. It was much, much quicker and easier to change them out. For example, if you have an open mount or just a shielded mount, like you say have with the twin 4-inch guns on HMS Belfast, since the mount tends to come as a one single unit, it's often much quicker and easier to just literally lift the entire mount off its turntable, drop it down onto the dockyard, and put a new mount on, and then let the ship go, which is a much, much quicker operation than having to unbolt the roof of a turret or a fully enclosed mount. And then the mount will be taken away, or perhaps the gun barrels will be detached from it at some point in the future, which can be done at a more relaxed pace. Then he follows up with, were the ships able to get major work done to other major systems like the engines, or was the priority just to get the barrels swapped out and get them back out to sea? Generally speaking, if a ship had worn through its gun barrels, that tended to imply there was some fairly active shooting going on, and so there was usually a priority to get them back out to sea, but that's not necessarily always the case. It could just be that the last engagement they took part in happened to have been the last bit of official wear that was allowable on those guns. So as you saw with Invincible, sometimes it was a case of get the guns in and out and maybe do some ancillary work surrounding that doesn't extend dockyard time by more than a few days. Other times, if it was part of a larger overhaul, then yeah, you could also get some more work done. But obviously, the major work that you might do otherwise would extend far past the time you needed to actually swap the guns out. For example, when Warspite wore out her guns bombarding the beaches of Normandy, she hit a mine on her way up to get new guns, which meant that because although she was then in dock for about 6 to 7 weeks, the vast majority of that time was spent trying to straighten out as many propeller shafts as possible rather than the gun switch out, which was done much quicker. How common were the facilities that were capable of performing this work? Not that common, on two grounds. Firstly, the cranes that you need to lift potentially a couple of 100 tons worth of gun up and down are, relatively speaking, rare in naval terms. I mean, look at the South American pre-dreadnought arms racer. When it was agreed to disarm, they suddenly realized that we don't actually have any cranes in South America capable of lifting out the main guns of some of the bigger ships. Those things are only available in the UK in their particular case, or the States, but they bought the ships from the UK, so that's where they were going to go. So you've got to have a heavy enough crane, and you might have a crane that's capable of lifting that kind of weight, but you've got to have a crane that's capable of lifting that kind of weight at the extension where it can actually reach over to the guns. So infrastructure there is one restriction. The other restriction is, does that shipyard, dockyard, etc. have transport links to a gun foundry and or a stock of new guns? Because ideally you want to be able to take this gun away to the gun foundry so it can be relined, the old one, and you want the new gun to be put in place. So of course that's going to have to come from the foundry at some point, whether it's stored at the foundry, stored in a warehouse, whatever. So that's the ideal. Now you can get away with moving guns around not by land, i.e. not by rail or not by road, perhaps by ship. For example, with the Japanese, with the Yamato's guns, they developed a specialist lift ship purely for the 18.1-inch guns. But that's a very unique, very specialist ship that you really don't want to risk. So even then, you're hopefully not going to be taking it very far, so still home waters. So, for someone like the USA, they will have East and West Coast facilities capable of doing that. The French, Toulon and either Brest or Cherbourg or other similar Atlantic ports, they'll have facilities capable of doing that. But for overseas facilities like the British, they're not going to have battleship gun swapping capability in every single port. Somewhere like Singapore, designed for their heavy maintenance of large ships, in theory should have that capability, but even then that would mean you'd have to ship out a stock of spare gun barrels to Singapore, as well as having the lift capability, all of which makes things more complicated. So these facilities would be quite rare. And then finally, could smaller ships like destroyers and small cruisers be serviced at more facilities? Yes, because you need a much lighter weight crane in the first place to lift off the mountings, and because the guns and potentially the entire mountings themselves are much lighter and take up much less space, and there's just more of them in existence, it's much, much easier to ship out and store those kinds of guns all over the place. And to be honest, at that point, even there may well be gun foundries that can help work on those guns, because they're smaller, therefore you need a small scale foundry in much more diverse places across the world. Jameson Betts asks, how does radar tell distance versus size of objects? So how it's displayed, completely different matter. You can see here two slightly different kinds of display, but the way of determining range and size is fairly simple, actually. It's some basic mathematics. Essentially, you have a known speed of travel of the radar pulse, which is the speed of light. If you then transmit a pulse, then by the time it returns to you, then simple mathematics will tell you how long that pulse has been in transit. So if you remember good old high school physics, speed equals distance over time. Therefore, distance equals speed multiplied by time. And since the pulse will have had to go out to the object and travel back, so it's traveled twice the distance, it's over 2. So the range to target is the speed of light multiplied by the time it took for the pulse to get back to you, divided by 2. Now you might think, well, hang on a minute, given that a radar is pulsing out loads and loads and loads of pulses, isn't there a chance it might receive a pulse that's perhaps 2 or 3 pulses ago and get confused? Well, no, because the speed of light is so insanely fast. So take the SG radar, for example, a pretty solid, decent, early US surface search radar found in a number of ships in the mid to late part of World War II. Now, it emits, depending on the exact model, somewhere between 775 and 825 pulses per second. So if we take a middle ground, 800 pulses per second. So 1 pulse every 800th of a second. But when you consider the speed of light, which is shorthanded to 3 times 10 to the 8 meters per second, it's actually like 299 something something something, but whatever, let's take 3 times 10 to the 8 as a easy shorthand. Well, in 1/800th of a second, therefore, a radar pulse would have travelled approximately 375,000 meters, or about 375 kilometers, just over 230 miles. Now, given that the SG radar was given a nominal range of between 15 and 20 nautical miles, depending on your source, you can see that that radar pulse would have gone well beyond the realms of it being able to detect a return by the time the next pulse is sent out. And of course, even if you divide that by 2 and you get down to just over 115 miles, you're still talking an order of magnitude more distance than the radar can actually detect. So in other words, you send a pulse out, one of your 800 pulses per second, and then even at the absolute maximum distance of detection, you're going to get that pulse back, and then you're going to wait about 10 times as long as you waited for that pulse to come back before the next pulse goes out. So you do not have to worry, at least with these kinds of radars, about pulses overlapping. So that gives you your distance, and then in terms of determining the size of the object, that's simply a function of the magnitude of the return. So if you send out your pulse with, using completely arbitrary figures, let's say you send your pulse out with 100 units of power, and your return comes back, and obviously you're going to have some signal attenuation from going all the way out and coming back. Only a fraction of that energy is going to come back in any case. But let's say, again, being completely arbitrary, that you get 10 units of power back. Okay, so that tells you something about the size of the object. If you then send out another pulse, and at roughly the same distance, but perhaps on a different bearing, you get a return that is only 5 units of power in strength, well, then you know that for the same distance, the second object you're detecting is half the size, or more accurately, has half the radar reflectivity. So you have to assume a certain arbitrary amount of radar reflectivity to determine the size of the object. And these sizes will be pre-calibrated. So someone will have set up an initial model of that radar and gone, okay, here's a 650 foot long battleship at 10 miles, and the return when it's broadside is this much. And now either we move the battleship or we move the radar, so it's 15 miles away, and the return is this much, and so on and so forth. And then, repeat the exercise with a destroyer, a cruiser, an aircraft in the case of air search radar, and you calibrate that into the display, and then obviously train the person. Well, if you see in the case of the left-hand one, if you see your oscilloscope style meter rise by a centimeter, that means the target is this big. If it rises by 5 centimeters, it's this big, and so on and so forth, and thus you tell the size. On an overhead PPI scope, you can perhaps use intensity of the pulse to determine size, as well as just overall size of the dot. BK Zhong asks, why did the Japanese even build Shimakaze when the construction of the AA-specialized Akizukis at the same time indicates they knew Shimakaze was going to be obsolete and effectively useless upon launch? Well, simply put, they didn't think that way. Remember that even in the time period when the Akizukis and the Shimakazes are being designed, which, late 1930s for construction in the very late 1930s and early 1940s, although aircraft and aircraft carriers are rapidly increasing in power, and the Japanese are obviously somewhat at the forefront of advocating their use and the defense against them with the case of the Akizukis, there are still severe limitations to aircraft, both real and perceived. Pretty much everybody thinks, including the Japanese, that aircraft carrier launched aircraft can do a lot of damage to targets that are stationary in harbour, and Pearl Harbor kind of shows that, but they are still of the opinion that a moving target that is capable of taking evasive action as well as defending itself will cause a dramatic decrease in the number of hits scored, and obviously if it's fully crewed it can do a lot of damage control as well, and therefore aircraft are still seen as something that can damage capital ships, perhaps kill carriers because carriers are far more vulnerable, but overall it is a force to diminish the enemy, not a force to wipe out the enemy. So you need your anti-aircraft equipped ships to stop the enemy diminishing you, especially if you're the Japanese Navy, because you have fewer ships to start with. But in terms of actually killing the enemy, you need surface gunfire or torpedoes because they're seen as more effective. And so that's a perception. Now, exactly how accurate that perception is obviously going to depend on time period, technology level, etc., and that can even vary in half-yearly increments, as well as your own personal perception of how effective carrier aircraft are. But nonetheless, that's more of a perception-based thing. But the reality-based thing in terms of limitations on carrier aircraft is simply that the carrier aircraft can't fly at night. Well, technically you can, but training your pilots to not crash into the ocean or stall out and actually find the enemy and actually find your way back again as well, that's a whole extra realm which effectively indicates that you can't fly at night even if the aircraft are physically capable of doing so, which is why the night flying doctrine and air to surface radar equipment shortly thereafter on Royal Navy strike aircraft is fairly unique for a good chunk of the Second World War. Now, if you are of the conclusion that your aircraft carriers cannot operate at night, and the enemy aircraft carriers presumably cannot operate at night, well, now the air is out of the equation, and bearing in mind you don't really know about radar or think that it's particularly effective in the late 1930s, your options for seeing at night are fairly limited as well, which is why the Japanese invest so much in night vision and so forth. So they're coming at it from a perspective of, well, our primary objective, the American fleet, can't operate its aircraft carriers at night and probably can't see very far at night either. So if we can't hit them with our own aircraft, what we can do is sneak up close, because they can't see us, with a destroyer, or multiple destroyers hopefully, loaded to the gills with torpedoes, and then we can put a bunch of torpedoes into them, and that, to be fair, if you're firing long lances at somebody, one or two long lance hits are probably going to be far, far more effective than a bunch of 500-pound bombs from a Val, or even the airdrop torpedoes from a Kate, simply because the long lance is such a much larger torpedo with a bigger explosive warhead behind it. So the idea under Kantai Kessin would be that the Shimakaze herself and obviously her planned sister ships would be part of the attack wave at night that puts a bunch of torpedoes into the enemy, hopefully after they've been somewhat disorganized and damaged during the day by air attack. So perhaps you can also pick off stragglers, which would be a little bit safer. And then the next day, when you've sunk a bunch of ships and heavily damaged a bunch more, then perhaps you can follow up with further airstrikes because they can finish off some of the really heavily damaged stuff that the Shimakaze swarm has left for you. Desert Box asks, what books on pre-dreadnoughts do you recommend? Well, it depends how much detail you want to go into, really. Now, if you want a more general overview, let's say, then Conway's All the World's Warships, if you can get your hands on a copy, is probably a good place to start because, as the name suggests, it will cover all the world's warships. And more specifically, it's Conway's actually All the World's Fighting Ships, 1860 to 1905. But if you want to get into a little bit more detail, then I tend to find that there's not that many hyper in-depth books that just are like, here are pre-dreadnought battleships, let's talk about them. There's a number of other decent overview books, but if you want to look at very specific pre-dreadnoughts, or as I said, pre-dreadnoughts in more detail, you tend to need to look at books covering nations' navies, because then they'll look at those individual battleship programs in a lot more detail. Now, for someone like Spain that only really has Pelayo, that means, unfortunately, as I'd had to, you pretty much have to find a Spanish language book on Pelayo and hope you can either read or translate Spanish. Whereas if you are looking at, say, British pre-dreadnoughts, there's a number of different choices. You can go for Norman Friedman's British Battleships of the Victorian Era, R.A. Burt's British Battleships 1889 to 1904, or Oscar Parks's British Battleships 1860 to 1950, although again that might be slightly harder to get your hands on. For the French, the aforementioned French Battleships of World War I by Jordan and Caresse is a really good place to start. In fact, I'd say that's pretty much probably your go-to if you want French pre-dreadnoughts in English all in one place. There are a number of other decent French naval history books that will cover their pre-dreadnoughts, but a good chunk of them are in French. The Japanese, there's of course Warships of the Imperial Japanese Navy 1869 to 1946 or 1945. Aidan Dodson's The Kaiser's Battle Fleet will give you a good workup of German pre-dreadnoughts. Obviously, Friedman's US Battleships covers US battleships, unsurprisingly. Russian and Soviet Battleships by Steve McLaughlin will cover you for the Russians, and so on and so on and so forth. Also, if you can either get your hands on the volumes or you can find a library that will send them to you, the Warship Annual Journal, starting with Warship 1, goes through to Warship 12, then it becomes year dated. Those are also quite good, especially if you can find an index, because there's always lots of interesting articles, but there's a lot of interesting class or ship specific articles that will cover pre-dreadnoughts through their series. The Dreadnought project used to have I think maybe still does, have a pretty good index of all the articles in that series, at least up to a certain point. Ewan Walkington, I think, asks, would you ever be interested in reshooting or just editing together old mini-series along with the questions from the associated Drydock segments? I'm not sure, because I think there's two elements into that. Reshooting or editing together old series with the questions from the various Drydock segments, personally, I don't think that would work, purely because a number of the questions from any given video are not necessarily strictly related to that video. Some of them might be a bit more general, but somewhat tangentially related. And obviously I have to make a certain selection. I can't answer every question, so there might be other questions that weren't asked. So if I was going to do a kind of, here's a bunch of Q&A specifically associated with this video and I'm putting it all together in one thing, then I'd have to go back and answer a bunch of other very specific to that video questions, like where did you get this bit of information from, 15 different questions on French pre-dreadnoughts, for instance, and so forth. But I'm not sure what the demand would be for essentially the same video, but now with a bunch of Q&A tacked onto the end. The other element of reshooting or editing together old mini-series, I have considered that in the past. I know some YouTube creators that have done mini-series have then released a kind of supercut of all of them together. Now, on the one hand, I'm sitting there going, does anybody really want that? Because, say, if I supercut together my Guadalcanal series, you'd be talking 6 to 8, possibly more hours of continuous narration on Guadalcanal. On the other hand, there's a bunch of you who listen to 6 hours worth of Drydock, so I guess for people who just need something to listen to all day at work or are driving long distances or on a flight, that might be attractive, having it all in one place. So, that I can see maybe might be worth doing, but if you think it's worth doing, let me know in the comments below. Yamashiro Kai asks, if HMS Campania hadn't been sunk in the dying days of the First World War, Do you think she would have been converted to a full carrier? And if so, what effects do you think this would have had on the build-up of carriers in the Royal Navy? Unfortunately, I don't really think so. Yes, she is about the same speed and actually somewhat larger than Argus, so you could argue perhaps the Royal Navy would have been interested in making her into a full carrier if they made Argus into a carrier. And she's actually even slightly longer, albeit not quite as wide and not quite as fast as Hermes. The simple fact is that even by the end of the First World War, Campania had been sidelined to a secondary role purely because even in the First World War, she was an old ship. She was about 2 decades old, and her machinery was in really poor state. So, going out of the First World War, you would have had an array of ships to choose from, and indeed the Royal Navy did have a whole bunch of ships to choose from for aircraft carrier conversion, including, the Vindictive, amongst others. And although size and speed did affect their choices to some degree, some of the other heavy influencing factors were how good is the ship's machinery, how much lifetime does it have on it. And with Campania, if they'd wanted to convert her, although she would have been within the appropriate size range, she would have been at the lower end of that size range, and she would have needed a complete reworking, probably outright replacement of her machinery, including conversion from coal to oil firing, and that would have just made it prohibitively expensive compared to taking a much newer, much better condition hull that you didn't have to do all that work for.
Tom asks, slightly odd question, but how many Age of Sail ships did the Royal Navy have floating, or not floating, before World War I, given that HMS Implacable, the 74-gunner, was only broken up in 1949? It's a little bit of a difficult one for a few reasons. Firstly, ships start changing their name quite a bit because a lot of the Age of Sail ships that are still around in the first decade and a half of the 20th century are school ships, accommodation ships, training ships, etc. And so they might still be carrying their original name. They might have been renamed after another older Age of Sail ship, or they might have been renamed anyway for various reasons as the various training establishments move, develop, are upgraded, or have additional ships come in. The other problem is, how do you define before World War I? Do you mean, summer 1914, or do you mean early 20th century? Because the other factor that really comes into play is that, well, essentially there's a surprising number. Even if you take the very beginning of 1914 as your cutoff point, you're still talking a couple of dozen at the very least between ships like Victory, Implacable, and Unicorn, for example, and then other ships that are being used in the more direct training school or hulk or accommodation ship roles. But the reason why I say it's a little bit difficult is because in the period immediately preceding World War I, during Fisher's tenure, there's a huge reduction and resorting of these ships. Partly because, let's face it, you're talking about hulls that are going to be 50 to 60 years old at minimum, and therefore potentially getting on a little bit. But also, remember, Fisher is purging the active duty Royal Navy of a lot of ironclads, both from frontline duty, because some people bizarrely have kept them there, and out of a lot of the reserves. And that means that during the 1900s and the early part of the 1910s, there's a huge wave of 1860s, 1870s, 1880s ironclads, etc., that are being suddenly shoved from reserve or even fleet duty into accommodation ship, training ship, etc., store ships roles, replacing older ships of the line. So in 1900, say up to about 1904, there's actually a huge number of old ships of the line floating around various Royal Navy bases. Again, mostly not looking like ships anymore, but they're still there. But then in that period from 1904 to 1914, I'd say easily 2/3 to 3/4 of them disappear, as they're either just condemned for being a bit rotted out, or for the most part actually just being outright replaced by old ironclads. 22NF2 asks, when it comes to visually identifying aircraft, there's the WEFT mnemonic: wings, engines, fuselage, and tail. Is there any equivalent for capital ships, including carriers? I don't know about a mnemonic, but there are certain steps that I would say you can take to at least get you in the ballpark for identifying ships. Unfortunately, capital ships and carriers, those are going to be very different. So, for example, for carriers, you would look for something like, say, is there an angled flight deck? Because if there is, then either the photo of the carrier or possibly the entire carrier itself post-dates the Second World War. Most likely. Obviously, you've got things like the Invincible class from the 70s and 80s and so forth, which are still straight deck. But if we're talking about full-size fleet carriers, an angled flight deck pretty much means that is a ship that's either built post-World War II or has been refitted post-World War II. So at least gives you a time period. Then you would look, I would say, for island. So does it have an island at all? And if so, where is it? So unless the island, well, if it's a flush decker or the island is anywhere other than on the right-hand side, you're almost certainly, again, looking at a pre-World War II vessel. And then you start looking into things like the flight deck, the number and type of anti-aircraft guns, and fairly rapidly you'd be able to come to a conclusion as to what you're looking at least very broadly. I mean, there are some things that are very, very obvious, like, Ranger's 6 funnels aft. That is the only ship that looks like that. But other times, you could get down to perhaps a Lexington class or a Yorktown class, even if just on some very basic checks, like I just mentioned, you might not necessarily be able to identify exactly which one. There are other clues, but they require both more detailed knowledge and hopefully a decent resolution photo. For capital ships, I would tend to go with the following process: number and type of guns, and then their location. Then I would look at the number of funnels. Then I would look at the deck. Is it continuous or is it stepped? And then I would look at the secondary battery and its location. And that should give you, again, a good ballpark of classes from which you can narrow down. So, for example, if we're looking at this photo, we'll start off with the guns. Okay, so it has 10 guns in 5 twin turrets, including 1 turret amidships. So that immediately, on balance, makes it most likely that this is a British vessel, or at least a British-designed vessel, because only the Texas and New York for the Americans, which are both ships of the same class, were built with that turret layout. Technically, Almirante Latorre shares this layout, but she is a British-designed vessel. The Koenigs also have this layout for the Germans, but the British have the Orions, the King George V's, and the Iron Dukes all following this pattern, plus, as I said, the British designs like Erin and Almirante Latorre. Now, in this case, the number of funnels don't really help us because pretty much all the ships with a single amidships turret and 5 turrets total do have 2 funnels. However, the location does help us. So we can rule out the French Bretagne class because the amidships turret is behind the 2 funnels. And for the same reason, we can rule out the Koenigs. So essentially, that leaves us, after 2 steps, with the New York class and something British or British designed. And then we move on to deck type, and the fact is we have the broken main deck. So, we've got the forecastle running back to just after the bridge structure, then it drops down a level. That allows us to eliminate New York and Texas because they have a continuous deck. And then we look at the secondary battery, and that immediately allows us to rule out the Iron Duke class, Erin, and Latorre, because they all have casement batteries in their hull. This ship does not. So now we've narrowed the choice down to the Orion or World War I King George V class, and now we can loop back to look at some closer details. For example, the fact that, again, relating to funnels, on the Orion class, the foremast is behind the forefunnel. On this ship, the foremast is forward of the forefunnel, so this makes it a King George V class, 1911 style. So we've got it down to a single class, and then we can start looking at very specific details to try and work out exactly which ship it is. Volunteer per order O'Sullivan asks, if in October 1913 Churchill had shared his crystal ball with the rest of the Admiralty, meaning they now have the benefit of hindsight, what preparations could be made? This is in reference to the decision to mobilise the Third Fleet just in time for the war. So if we limit the hindsight to there is going to be a war in the summer of 1914, and you need to get ready for it, there are a few things that could have been done. Obviously, you could mobilise Third Fleet a little bit sooner. That would allow you more time to find crew, both obviously from the reserves, the volunteer reserves, and from perhaps an additional surge of volunteers if you push recruitment a bit harder, because obviously this is before conscription would come in. And that in turn would let you get more ships out into the water, and also you would want to check them over, make sure their engines are working, make sure the crews are working with their systems, essentially work them all up. You could also redo the distributions of ships throughout the world. So, for example, Goeben is in the Mediterranean with Breslau. Well, if you know that, and you know that Goeben might have a little bit of a speed edge, then instead of scattering the fleet's battle cruisers all over the place, you perhaps would send Princess Royal instead of off to the Caribbean, as was done historically. Maybe you send Princess Royal to the Mediterranean, and she might have a decent chance of catching Goeben in that chase at the beginning of the war. Likewise, instead of muddling around with what exactly you're going to send to the South Pacific, or even potentially to the Australia station, because you know the East Asia squadron's out there, you might send a couple of the Invincible type battle cruisers either over to join up with HMAS Australia and her lot to immediately, or perhaps to Japan, to immediately go after the Germans at Tsingtao. Or you might try and play things clever and go, well, hang on a minute, if the Japanese have the Congos, they might get him, and HMS Australia might get him. But then, logically, looking at the world map, if they don't get him, his only place to go is South America, so maybe we should send a couple of the Invincibles over to Craddock. And then Craddock will have, obviously, a significantly stronger force. Beyond that, when you talk about hindsight, you're talking about things like, the effectiveness of U-boats, whether or not the High Seas Fleet is going to commit to anything, what preparations you may or may not make for Gallipoli, but those are more of the tactical level considerations rather than just this is what we can do to improve our footing when it comes to war. I suppose the other thing you could probably do is start improvements on Scapa Flow sooner, so you don't have to head off to Ireland, which means you probably won't lose Audacious. A.B. Coates asks, during the Age of Sail, how difficult was it to perform a boarding action? What were the main difficulties a boarding party faced, and how common was it for the ship's crew to successfully repel such an attack? Performing a successful boarding action, or a boarding action at all, was actually something of an acquired skill. For the first thing, you've actually got to get your ship into a position where you can board, and that obviously requires manoeuvring your ship and hopefully, or most likely, getting rid of at least some of the enemy's ability to maneuver. Now, whether that means shooting through some of their masts or sails, or getting rid of somebody who's at the helm, or shooting the rudder, or just having a higher performance ship that happens to be upwind, and therefore you can ride down on them, which obviously requires navigational skills. All of these things, or some combination thereof, you have to give you the advantage to actually get close enough to board, because obviously your opponent might not want to be boarded and can do their level best to not be boarded. Then you have to hope that your ship, well, at least unless you're Admiral Cochrane, is vaguely in the same weight class, because that is going to usually have some effect on the overall height of your ship. So, for example, again, unless you're Cochrane, if you take a 6th rate frigate and you try and board a 1st rate, your first job is going to be a 15 to 20 foot climb up the side of a ship, which probably isn't going to end well for you. Now, assuming that you are of roughly the same height and you have somehow come to a point where you are next to each other, you now have to contest with another fun little thing, which is the tumble home of the ships, because obviously Age of Sail ships don't have sheer sides. So how bad is the tumble home on each ship? Because you might have the ships right up against each other at the widest point of their hull, but that is most likely to mean that your decks where you're actually crossing over might be 3 or 4 feet apart. They might be 6, 8 or more feet apart. And forget Hollywood style, swinging on ropes. For one thing, where are those ropes coming from? And for another thing, it's not that good an idea. I mean, you see it a lot in Pirates of the Caribbean, but to give them credit, they did at least show some of the bigger problems with that, because if you look at through some of the more wild boarding sequences, you actually see people who are swinging on the ropes getting picked off by gunfire, or people just waiting for them with spears and swords when they get to the end of their rather predictable arc. So yeah, don't do that. If possible, use the poop deck, or if you're in an older ship, the forecastle, to try and board from a position of advantage height-wise. Then you've got the problem that, well, you can't send everybody from your deck to board the enemy, because otherwise you have no defense against them coming and boarding you. But that usually will mean that if the enemy who is defending is going to have more people to defend against your attack, so given they have a natural defender's advantage as well, that probably isn't going to end too well. So your next task is to try and thin out those numbers, whether permanently or at least make them duck for cover. And that's where, guns mounted on the quarterdeck, on the poop deck, in the bow, etc., loaded hopefully with grape shot or similar, can help clear the decks. This is also what sharpshooters are for. So I reduce the number of enemy crew on deck, on the upper decks, and or make them duck. Because, well, if you've ever done boarding exercises, which I have done in HEMA context, one of the first things you'll discover is that because the enemy can form ranks, and you really can't because you've got to cross that gap, if you board roughly equal numbers, it's very, very easy for your defending party with boarding pikes and things like that to essentially just corral and cut down the boarders as they come over one by one or in small groups. And this is also part of what reducing the numbers on deck is for, because hopefully then there won't be enough people to corral you. So assuming you've now got your small party of mixture of Marines, officers and men over, you now have to engage in a mixed hand-to-hand and close-range firearms fight for control of the ship's deck. Your primary aim is to try and get aft to the quarterdeck or the poop deck, because what you want to do is either find the officers and get them to submit, and the officers are most likely to be over there. But even if they aren't, that's also where the ship's helm is. Now, theoretically, ships can steer from below, but the primary helm is up there. Also, right at the stern is the ship's ensign, or the national flag. And if that is lowered, that is the international signal for surrender. Now, the enemy might not actually have surrendered, but if you get control of that area and you hoist down their colours, then not only will the other ships on their side think that you have surrendered, but they might also think you've surrendered, as in the crew on the ship. They might think, an officer has chosen surrender, so they might stop resisting. And that will be just enough time for you to, actually make that permanent. But even if you can't do that, or even if you think that might be a bit of a dishonourable trick, the fact is the quarterdeck and the poop deck make excellent defensive positions. So once you've boarded an enemy ship, it's a good place to hold against counter-assault and bring over more boarders. And then you have to win the melee and firearms fight to finish off the boarding action and hopefully get them all to submit and surrender the ship. So yeah, there's quite a few steps, quite a few issues you have to overcome, and in terms of successfully repelling such an attack, it's not the majority of the time, let's be fair, but throwing back a boarding party, at least the first time, because some combats involve multiple boarding attempts, did happen not inconsiderable number of times. So you're not talking about single-digit percentages, but less than 50%. And the reason it's less than 50%, despite all those defensive advantages I outlined, is specifically because everyone's aware of those defensive advantages. For the most part, people won't launch a boarding action until they've done an awful lot of risk mitigation and are fairly convinced they're going to carry the boarding action, which usually obviously then means they're going in with a whole load of advantages rather than disadvantages, and hence the average boarding action is usually more likely to be successful than not. Tankodromis asks, for the Italian refit battleships, would it be possible to replace the triple 12-inch guns with twin 15-inch, i.e. Littorio guns in a twin turret, basically keeping Q turret and removing the twin 12-inch and keeping the features of the historical refits otherwise? I would have some immediate concerns. The two that seem most obvious are, one, as you can see here with Conte de Cavour, the amidships turret is rather a tight fit, so replacing 12-inch 45 caliber guns with 15-inch 50s, I'm not sure you've literally got enough room to swing a cat in there. With that said, considering the absolutely ridiculous extent of the rebuilds that were done, you could make an argument that you could relocate the superstructure that would get in the way. So I suppose it's not a complete ender there. The other big problem, I think, would be the fact that if you want the refit speed, well, Q turret's magazine is taking up a huge amount of space, which is really where you want to put more machinery. But again, I suppose if you really wanted to, you could perhaps have all the space forward of the turret turned into machinery space, because obviously you've got the superfiring forward twin, which should be removed, and maybe keep some aft as well, which would then allow you to perhaps move the turbines back to occupy some of the space occupied by the second superfiring turret, the aft one. But it would leave you with a really weird machinery layout, which I'm not sure would work, but let's assume somehow that it would. Weight-wise, on balance, purely for the turrets, I think you might just get away with it. Looking at, the average weights of a 15-inch twin turret across the board, and then, bearing in mind that you're going to be saving about 1,000 tons taking off the twin turrets, the weight difference just about adds up. But of course, that doesn't account for the extra weight of shells and charges in the magazine, the new hoists and machinery, all of that extra weight as well. So you might actually be on a little bit of a net weight loss. Then again, you've got these really tall barbettes you're ripping out as well, so that's going to save some weight. So weight-wise, yes, in theory, you probably could just about get away with it. But your other problem is, of course, going to be that you're going to have to completely rip out all the existing ammunition handling and other machinery further down in the barbettes, and probably going to have to resize the barbettes as well, unless you somehow manage to finagle the barbette diameter to be exactly the same. The barbette diameter is theoretically actually not terrible for at least a compact twin 15, but it would have to be a compact one. So yeah, buying guns in from Krupp, not really an option, although then again, obviously the Italians can build their own. So could it be done? Yes, in theory, I think you could probably just about get away with it, at least on paper. You would almost certainly have an extremely weird and inefficient machinery layout. You would have to completely relocate funnels, trunking, masts, superstructure, etc., and that could possibly be to the detriment of the ship, because you're going to have to be moving them further out, so you're going to have to completely redo your weight balance requirements. And if it was almost any other ship, I would have said no. The only reason I'm saying you might get away with it is because the Italians did so much in terms of changing the structure of these ships in the first place that most of my more immediate objections are countered by the fact that, well, the Italians already ripped that bit away and replaced it anyway, so why not? It'll be hideously expensive and probably somewhat impractical, but it could happen. And that's it for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody, and I hope to see you again in another episode soon.